Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives
From Southeast Asia.
Good morning, this is Arlene and you're listening to ASEAN, the voice of discovery and sharing. Today on our Monday Morning Matters, we will discuss about ASEAN. Can it realize its sustainable development goals set by the United Nations by 2030? We have Datuk Dr. Denison Jayasuriya. He is the Secretary General of PROHAM and he'll be sharing with us his view on this matter. First of all, welcome to the studio, Dr. Dr. Denison.
Good morning. It's nice to be with you again.
And how are you this morning?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Busy as usual with so many different things going on.
And one of it is you actually held a meeting to discuss on the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes, a number of organizations put this together, including PROHAM, the Global Movement of Moderates, and the Institute of Ethnic Studies. I think almost 40 over people gathered at the Kuala Lumpur Convention Center to discuss the theme of Sustainable Development Goals and Human Rights as a framework for conflict resolution and mediation.
In the past,
yes.
there's the focus were more on the MDG, the Millennial Development Goals.
Yes.
Why has changed to Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, the UN set a target for the MDGs, and that target ended. And as a result, the UN or the global community together since Rio Plus 20 formulated the Sustainable Development Goals. There are slight differences or major differences between the MDG and the SDGs. One definitely is in the MDGs, the focus was only on the developing world with socio-economic or poverty addressal as its key focus, whereas in the Sustainable Development Goals, it is global. It applies to both developed and developing world, because even within the developed world like the US or Canada or England, there is a disadvantaged section or marginalized section, they are poor or inequalities in their society. And so it's more a comprehensive global agenda with 17 goals and 169 targets. It's much more comprehensive and it has set a 15-year agenda.
What were the main loopholes that MDG did not address previously?
I think while the framework of MDG and SDG are similar, the SDGs only had 8 goals, whereas the Sustainable Development has 17. In the earlier one, it wasn't an integrated focus in which economic, social, and environment are put together. Now, the main thrust is on 5 areas, which is more integrated form and more sustainable approach for people development as well as the earth. So bringing in environment together with human rights, good governance is strong. And there are 5 key words which the preamble brings out, which is at the heart of the document. One is people, second is planet, third is prosperity or economic development, fourth is peace, because to undo violence, to protect human rights of all people. And fifthly is partnership. It's not just partnership within, not just the state, public, private sector, and civil society and local community. It's also between rich and poor countries, so that there is a joint partnership in ensuring the world is a better world for all human beings, including the environment.
So there's more intersectional framework in the
Yes.
SDG this time.
And it's much more comprehensive. The very fact it is 17, it's 169 targets. It might have over 300 indicators. So it's going to be a mind-boggling sort of task for any government. I think the bigger governments, more well-to-do governments will find it easier. The smaller governments might have capacity and resources that might prohibit them from its full realization. Nonetheless, it is much more comprehensive. It's not just socio-economic and cultural. It also brings the element of civil and political. It's bringing the element of the environment. It's bringing the element of good governance. So what's basically saying is a country should not just focus on high income growth or just measured by GDP, gross domestic product, income measurements, but it needs to measure itself from human well-being and sustainable indicators. So sustainability of the environment, of the earth, its forests, its water is as important as generating income and wealth.
Mm-hmm. And recently, Helen Clark, she was the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and currently she's the chair of the United Nations Development Group. From her visit in Malaysia, what was her main message to countries in Southeast Asia and particularly to Malaysia?
Yeah, Her Excellency Helen Clark gave a public lecture in KL. I attended that. And she was also on a number of panels in the Global Transformation Forum, which both the UN and Pemandu and the government of Malaysia hosted. Her main thrust was to sort of give this holistic, comprehensive, integrated understanding of the SDG and calling on the governments to make a key commitment and also calling on civil society to play its role in monitoring and supporting, including the private sector. So she was here on a number of meetings and she very well presented also from her experience as a former prime minister, also in her global role now in the UNDP and the UN system. She came out very convincingly in the meetings. And of course, she is committed to a much more holistic and participatory process in development compared to many other heads of state who are quite protective of the political realm or are not open to public criticism of their failures. So I think she's giving a reassuring agenda to governments, not just in Malaysia but the region, and I think she's traveling to other parts of the world as well on this theme.
But on the other hand, do you think Malaysia and ASEAN as a whole are ready to not necessarily implement, but to at least review and somehow adopt, some of the key challenges or the key priorities of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, I think in the context of Malaysia, there are some good opportunities because the government of Malaysia, even before the launch of the SDG on September the 25th at the UN headquarters in New York, Malaysia had already launched its 11th Malaysia Plan, which is a 5-year development planning. And it already had a strong theme of inclusive development, a commitment to green economy or the strengthening of its commitment to the environment, as well as its special target on the bottom 40%. So these are great achievements because Malaysia is in line with the global agenda. However, Malaysia's participatory process more accountable institutional structures, greater compliance to human rights, greater openness to critical analysis and thinking, there is a shortfall and deficit, even enabling civil society to participate, access to data and information. So there is a plus point, but the full potential, there are some minus points. And so the government of Malaysia must be far more open to participation of civil society, provide access to data, raw data for independent academic analysis, and strengthening of mediating institutions like Suhakam, strengthening credibility of the environmental impact assessment and all.
Mm-hmm.
At the ASEAN level too, there are some pluses and minuses. The pluses are that ASEAN has made a strong commitment in its April meeting in Kuala Lumpur for the realization of an ASEAN community, that ASEAN, the 10 countries, want to really work together and see the emergence of a real people-centered ASEAN. That's the plus point. And at the political level, they have been doing well. However, ASEAN is very restrictive and narrow in its accountability process as a whole. Even its Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission doesn't have the power to go and do independent investigation of violations of human rights. So there are some major concerns, especially if we want to have a people's agenda in the context of the movement of migrant workers and the protection of workers. Even Malaysia is a receiving country from Myanmar, from Cambodia, from other parts of the world as well, Vietnam, and there is a movement, Singapore too, and the richer parts.
But is there any conversation among Malaysians or among governments to address all these key challenges of sustainable development goals?
I think both at the academic level and civil society, like the ASEAN People Forum, they have facilitated many such discussions, many reports and writing. It's the ASEAN way, or the ASEAN values as they call it, or the ASEAN non-interference. We see this in at least the inability at the regional level, one like to resolve the haze problem, two, the refugee situation of the Rohingya boat people. And these have not resulted in a more aggressive, collective, interventionist approach that moves beyond borders. So you're a community. Am I my brother's keeper of the Rohingya, or am I concerned for human trafficking in the region or for labor movement? Then I think we need to strengthen that. I'm not saying the governments are not talking. I'm not saying that the civil society or academics are not. But we are all not sitting around the same table, and the mechanisms for greater accountability at the regional process, like an ASEAN court or ASEAN tribunal or ASEAN set of things, is not adequately set up, in contrast to movement of investment and big businesses.
So are you implying that everyone is setting up their own talk shop, but they are not actually communicating with each other?
I think there is communication, but not moving in the fast pace that some of us want. Neither is it as open as the United Nations process. Because in the United Nations, accreditation to civil society, participation of civil society and academic bodies, recruitment of consultants, and the financial resources to do that seems to be better organized and better coordinated. In contrast to the powers and the terms of reference to the ASEAN Secretariat, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Human Rights Commission. So more needs to be done for regional collaboration. More needs to be done alongside to instill greater protection for the peoples of ASEAN. So Malaysia cannot say that migrant workers and their children will not have access to health or educational facilities. So that contravenes the Convention on the Rights of Children. So how can we build an ASEAN community if we do not see a fellow ASEAN Myanmarese or Indonesian or Cambodian as a fellow brother here when they are suffering or they don't have access or we're going to charge? So what is Malaysia's commitment to this? Because we talk of an ASEAN community. If you're not talking of an ASEAN community, that's all right. But we are trying to have a shared regional prosperity, security. So for people to people, then there must be a greater commitment, because SDG also talks about partnerships.
That's true.
Trying to address inequalities not only within the country, but across the region. So the richer parts of ASEAN, for example, Brunei, Singapore, Malaysia, parts of Indonesia, parts of Thailand, the rich in the Philippines, have a sort of commitment to the rest of the poorer sections of ASEAN. Poorer sections meaning Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam. Then only you will have this addressing of threats and security issues in the region. So we shouldn't just see cooperation for trade and income growth. We should also see for the protection of the forests, for the protection of indigenous people, for the protection of our oceans, for the protection of water sources, and things of that sort.
Yep. Anyway, Dr. Nelson, we will take one short break. And when we return, we'll discuss further, especially on the commitment from the private sector in the case of the commitment towards the Sustainable Development Goals.
Monday Morning Matters.
Perspectives from Southeast Asia.
Hi, welcome back. This is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN. And of course with me, I am going to continue the interview with Datuk Dr. Dennis Jayasuriya, Secretary General of ProHam, on our discussion today, which is, can ASEAN really realize its goal on Sustainable Development Goals by 2030? So, there are a lot of criticism people have towards the Sustainable Development Goals. One of it is about it being too ambitious and too focusing on poverty eradication rather than addressing inequality that is happening in today's society, which is to focus more on redistributing wealth. But what is your personal opinion on the SDG? Do you think it's achievable in the long run?
Okay, I think some general comments, but first to your specific note, whether SDG is too poverty focus. I think the MDGs had that as a stronger focus. Here you have goal 1, which is to end poverty in all its form everywhere. But at the same time, by goal 10, we also have reduced inequality within a society or a nation as well as among countries. So both issues of poverty, because you have still a sizable number of people at the global level, because we're talking of the globe as a whole, who are still living in poverty under $2 a day. So I think that is an unacceptable area, and there are specific targets set. I think there are 5 targets at that point, and then also in reducing inequality. So I think both are included. I think what is emerging is 17 too much? But what one has to recognize is the interconnectedness between all these things, between poverty, gender, human rights, education, health, natural resources, governance, human rights violation, protection of the environment, global. So you're talking not of the effort of a small civil society in one corner of the world. You're talking of a government, and you're talking of billions of people around the world who need assistance and support in a sustainable way. And therefore, the agenda has to be far more comprehensive because the UN in itself is now, 70 years? And as a result, it has a long history of assistance across on health, on education, on development. And the UN has the expertise, and the world has the technical ability and the resources to resolve this at a global level. I think our difficulty is, can we get the global act together? Can we have cooperation? Can we have greater sharing of responsibility? Because one of the clauses which is there, the principle of common and differentiated responsibility. You can't expect a developing poorer country to protect its natural resources if that is the main source of the country's income or economic growth. So the global community would have, especially countries in the developed world, will have to take greater responsibility to protect the natural resources, let's say of the forests, of the oceans, of the rivers across the world, and not just in their own backyard. So I think this differentiated responsibilities put greater onus on developed countries as much as the rich and the affluent across the world. So personal consumption patterns are also called. So let's say a country, which is often indicated like the Japanese, or the rising rich in China, or the rich and affluent in Europe, their sort of lust for certain sort of things, or their desire for certain sort of things at the global level would have to be in some ways restricted so that the Earth's resources are not depleted for only one section of the world. So there needs to be this global responsibility, and this is where big businesses, multinational companies, groups that are extracting timber and resources, oil, other sorts of things, cannot just use the principle of maximization of profits and not bear the cost of it. I think the problem is people are sort of taking it all for their own wants and not paying for, long-term, intergenerational protection for the next generation, the Earth's resources. So I think that is the call, that is the moral obligation. But knowing human nature, you need to have laws and enforcement that can restrict this and also share. Because people tend to share more money for buying of arms and for security purposes.
But do you also think that it is also the private sector not participating enough of their effort to somehow do more on the ground, especially in terms of trying to be more sustainable?
Yes. I think private sector at the global level, multinationals and others have come up with what is known as corporate social responsibility. There's a greater regulatory framework.
But is it enough?
Yeah, I think the question is the corporate social responsibility only giving handouts? Does it move beyond to building self-reliance, sustainability, greater equitable sharing of the profits? Then I think you need stronger regulatory frameworks, even taxation across land, in order that there can be a more equitable and just sharing of the profits. So I think so big companies give CSR and they get good publicity, but the way they treat the workers, the minimum wages, the protection of housing conditions, a fair and just wage, are things that ILO and other institutions are regulating. And this is something that needs to be strengthened. And along this line, greater community ownership like solidarity economy, profit sharing. So the private sector would have to come up much more. And
But
this is
in the
yeah.
government level, it seems like the private sectors usually would be the ones to hinder all these laws to be implemented, such as a minimum wage, better labor protection and labor rights. How do you
Both. I think sometimes there's a collaboration between politicians and the political powers with the economic powers for this understanding of a trickle-down approach.
Yeah, and the question
to
is
development.
the question is how can we break this vicious cycle, especially in developing countries?
Yeah, I think it is the rise of citizens, its regional monitoring mechanisms, global civil society, the UN, ILO, other sorts of institutions that places greater demands on both private sector and government, because sometimes government want the investment. They might justify it. It's better to get $3 a day rather than demanding for 10, because the investment might go to cheaper markets where the cost of production is lower. And so that's been the struggle for countries. So they want to attract investments. And so I think accepting a more sustainable, human rights friendly, at the same time market-oriented approaches, it's a difficult balance, but this is where the empowerment of local communities, access to data, greater compliance at the global level, international financing for development, which has been a big discussion in this process. And there was this global meeting at Addis Ababa that looked at some of these things at the third international conference on financing for development. I think this is where it shouldn't be seen as a Western agenda trying to impose. Developing countries and alternative financial sources and capacity building and protection becomes quite critical. So it is a reformist sort of agenda, which I think the SDG is. The criticism is it has not come far enough for the protection of the poor and the disadvantaged and the marginalized. But nonetheless, they had to find a common denominator, because one of the criticisms of the 17 SDG goals is that there is within the 17 goals and the 169 specific targets, there's no single reference of the word, even human rights is not used, although justice is used, equal opportunities, equal outcome, protection.
That's my subsequent question about the SDG. It seems to shy away on critical words that reflect our current society. I mean, one of it is human rights. It seems like the word itself to be very anti-development or anti-progress.
So one way is to take the SDG, transforming our world, and only take the section on the 17 goals and targets. That is one approach. The other is to take the full 36-page document with, I think, over 88 paragraphs. If we take it in its totality, then human rights is a central focus. But unfortunately, what I've been told is some governments will pick and choose. They will say, look, we don't have the resources. We want to prioritize. So we will prioritize of the 17, only a few, but not others. And so there isn't accountability and compliance mechanism in the SDGs, in contrast to what one can call the universal periodical review. Once in 5 years, every country is to report to the UN, but that reporting process is not as tightly guarded like the universal periodical review. So it might mean that this is an aspirational document. There might be targets realized, but there is no compliance to specific outcomes at the country level. So
and
if one
why
country,
is that so?
That's what the UN has decided, because it's a collective decision. Ultimately, it came to the common denominator of acceptance. So countries, I think there were more 150 heads of state present at September 25th meeting. They came to a unanimous consensus view. I think this is where, over the next 15 years, the global community and standard setting needs to be compliant with both protection of the environment as well as protection of human rights in the context of a right to development.
Mm-hmm.
So unless governments of the world make that, and in ASEAN, you already know many countries are intolerant to civil society.
Mm-hmm.
They are intolerant to alternative views. They are intolerant to any critical review. They are intolerant to human rights issues or a violation area. And as a result, one would see that whether countries will carry on business as usual or they would reform. And I think this is where, if the UN and the global body had much higher funding allocation for countries that did a more holistic, integrated development that took economic, social, and environmental protection in equal level, then I think you would see. And I think the Addis Ababa area was to get greater compliance in a positive way, but the global community then needs to see that. So would situations change? I think we are hopeful, but for some countries, they have not even highlighted. I think, unfortunately, in Malaysia, the Prime Minister did not highlight sustainable development goals and his commitment as he did in New York.
Do you think it is because countries are not legally binded to highlight the SDG as part of their national process?
No, I think there is countries are making such a commitment in New York. They come back, they make. I think for Malaysia, it would have thought we have fulfilled most of this in the 11th Malaysia Plan. But some of us felt the Prime Minister, when he gave his budget speech that day, would make reference to what he made a commitment in New York, and whether 2016 budget reflected any of the promises of the SDG, then we didn't get it. So then domestic politics in each country seem to prevail. Even ASEAN agenda in Malaysia, we are the chair of ASEAN for 2015. We had the big meeting in April. We're going to have another meeting in November. We have world leaders coming. But the national discourse on ASEAN people, I didn't even see a single poster up on any of the roads about the ASEAN community in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
So we are caught with our own political conflicts and struggles, and the discussion between a member of parliament and someone else in an investment arm seems to take precedence over SDGs or even the ASEAN agenda.
Malaysia,
because
because
the local scene. So unless government and the politicians give that emphasis, even parliament, I don't know, because if the budget didn't have that as a central piece, then SDGs being debated in the parliament as a framework in Malaysia, or SDGs in the November meeting, whether it will be central to the discourse of the future, are all questionable frameworks.
Mm-hmm. But how can Malaysia address SDG in the ASEAN context? ASEAN itself is already hindered by its non-interference policy. For example, talking about the issue on haze, everything seems to be very rhetorical, very not direct to the point. How can countries in ASEAN address issues that is affecting regionally?
Yeah, I think it's up to these governments now, because both the Rohingya refugee situation that impacted Myanmar, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, haze is impacting Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, I think needs a more conflict resolution mechanism that moves beyond diplomacy to find fault with who is the cause of it, whether it's a private sector company burning up the place. More independent mechanisms are needed, and I agree with you, that needs to take place. And likewise, the mechanisms of ASEAN, it's whether the ASEAN countries want to allow that or not. Because unlike the UN Secretariat, which is more a technocratic and professional institution, the ASEAN Secretariat is more like recording secretaries. And the governments and the ambassadors in Jakarta, in the ASEAN, play the deciding role, and the chair. So the chair takes the lead. So Malaysia has a great role, but unfortunately we have not played it because of other domestic politics that has distracted us. I think 1 year is too short. Before you know it, the chair is over, and we are passing it on to Laos by November. So it's too fast.
Yeah.
1 year chair. So maybe
definitely it's too fast.
ASEAN might need to look at, like the UN, that its secretary and its chair could have more powers, could have more delegated responsibility. That is something ASEAN countries would have to, and including greater participation of the ASEAN community, like the People's Forum in Malaysia played a key role. Malaysia facilitated positively, even financed sizably the ASEAN People's Forum.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, it's country to country and not
ASEAN as a whole.
ASEAN agenda as a whole. So Laos has already indicated they don't want civil society coming in and messing around and questioning missing persons and violations of human rights in Laos.
And other countries in Southeast Asia are not jumping in to address this, are they?
No, because countries similar like Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, Myanmar, and some of the other countries do not want a strong human rights framework. Although they accepted the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration, they also set up the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission, and it is an intergovernmental. It's not an independent human rights one, and there are a lot of restrictions. They can't even do independent inquiry. You cannot have a regional complaints mechanism. So we are quite far away from where Europe is. So people say we are culturally confined to this. But nonetheless, I think we need to see what best can we do in the future.
Yeah, my final.
I don't think it's
my-
don't think it's all gloomy as the haze. The haze has lifted the skies in Malaysia. At least what I saw yesterday. Today I've not stepped out.
Today the weather is quite good actually.
Yeah.
But
and,
I have
yes.
my final question about the SDG agenda for 2030. Do you seriously think, with the current state of ASEAN, do you think ASEAN is even near to achieve that goal in 2030?
I think each country is expected to reach certain targets. I think they have made individual national commitment at New York. There are mechanisms of the UN, the UNDP, the UN agencies in each of the country facilitating it. The SDGs went through a rigorous government scrutiny before it was finalized. So governments cannot say they are throwing this away. So I think that is there at the country level. There will be monitoring, there will be data gathering, and I'm hopeful that it will move beyond. Whether all the issues vis-a-vis environmental protection as well as human rights protection will come alongside poverty and addressing inequality, it's still questionable now. But I'm hopeful that the agenda will move forth because the UN has a huge instrument and at the global level and its agencies. And civil society has already started discussing and monitoring, like what we have done on the Malaysian situation. The ASEAN People's Forum are meeting in November. Gerald and the others who are leading this movement will be meeting in November as well. And so we are hopeful that some forums are there. I think we call on the governments of ASEAN to be as open as the UN is, to see civil society and academicians, including public intellectuals, as co-partners in development, and not seeing them as just in negative light, but seeing them as positive contributors. So all we have is hope, and the document is calling for the theme of transformation of our world, and we have 15 years. So I think once the periodical reports emerge, and this will be complemented still with the UPR process, the individual treaty compliance, like Malaysia's Convention on Women, Children, Disability. Although we are behind all these reports, we need to back up at the global level to international commitments, and that is our hope for the future.
With that, thank you very much, Dr. Dennison.